got started here.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming. I see there's quite a lot of you. Thanks for dealing with all the rearranging. My name is Tyler, if none of you have been here yet since I've been working, but welcome. And if you're returning, thanks for coming back. But today we have Ciara Pares Kempf with us, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
You got it perfect.
All right. And today she will be telling us about Ruby Garrett and the colorful life of Butte's famous madam that has been mythologized and embellished for decades. Ruby Garrett was forced into prostitution as a minor, survived abusive husbands, and murdered one. Became the owner of Butte's last and longest operating brothel, served prison time for tax evasion. But friends knew Ruby as a fun-loving traveler and a grandmotherly do-gooder, and her reputation as a good neighbor stretched from Butte to Divide on the Big Hole, where she retired. We'll look at the facts and the myths of the remarkable life of this true Butte character today as Ciara presents and tells you more about her. Again, thank you, Ciara, for presenting. And, go ahead.
Thanks for the introduction. So I got involved in the Ruby Garrett story through the Big Hole Historical Society. I'm a volunteer and a historian, and I write on stories of the Big Hole. We've published 2 books on the history of the Big Hole, and in volume 3, I'm going to include Ruby Garrett's story. So I'm still collecting stories. If you or someone you knew Ruby, or you have a story you'd like to share, I would be delighted to have it, to share it with the public. My email is right here. There's business cards on the table. You're welcome to come up and chat with me afterwards. I'd love to collect all the stories I can of her remarkable life. So we'll get started here. Ruby was born July 19th, 1917 in Sisseton, South Dakota. There we go. The 8th of 10 children, born to Frank Xavier Schmaus and Anna Ulrika Peterson. Her father was a German immigrant, and her mother was from Norway. Her father named her Ruby because she was his little jewel. Not too many awes, I'm afraid. Those might have been the kindest words she ever heard from her father. The family lived dirt poor on a series of rented homesteads on the Traverse Lake Indian Reservation. She was raised in poverty, and she was surrounded by exhausted, hopeless, brutal adults. Her father beat her mother. He once nearly killed a brother after the brother tossed a shoe insolently. She had no relief among her relatives either. One of her uncles kicked her pet cat to death in front of her. One of her aunts waited until the family had left the family home for the day, set it on fire, and sat on a hillside and watched it burn. In 1925, when Ruby was 7 years old, her father, Frank, died, supposedly of a heart attack when they were moving to a new home on the northern boundary of Minnesota. One by one, her mother was forced to send away the children to relatives or out to work because she couldn't afford to take care of them all. By 1930, which is the time of the census shown, Ruby's mother, Annie, was working as a live-in servant for a widowed dentist, Dr. James A. Robertson. She made $3 per week. She kept 3 kids at home, her 3 youngest. Ruby and her 2 brothers are shown there. From a young age, Ruby's mother counted on her to take care of the 2 youngest ones while her mother was working. A few doors down from the dentist's home where she lived was a man who ran a pool hall and a barber shop. Years later, this man would serve time at Leavenworth Federal Prison for selling liquor during Prohibition. In the height of the Great Depression, on an impoverished Indian reservation, few people had cash to pay for their booze, but most people had large families. And this man would buy young girls and pimp them out. This man was how Ruby got introduced to the sex trade. Now, this will be the most uncomfortable part of the lecture today, I hope. But I do want to be explicit about this. As a young girl, Ruby was sold to a stranger and raped. I say that explicitly because keep that in mind as we look at the decisions that Ruby made over the rest of her life. Imagine how this must have affected her sense of self-worth. Thankfully, there was one bright spot in Ruby's youth, high school. The routine of classwork, for the first time, she was separate from her brothers. She was free to experiment who she was as she was growing up. Ruby had an ironic sense of humor, and she enjoyed performing in school plays. She must have been delightful to watch. One of the women who knew her said she had a tinkling laughter like wind chimes. You could hear that laughter all over the building, she said. One of those laughs where when you heard it, you had to start laughing too, even if you didn't know it was funny. Ruby made a goal for herself in high school. She needed to get away from Sisseton and escape the cycle of poverty that trapped those around her. So as soon as she graduated, she went to live with an aunt in St. Paul, Minnesota. Now, this is still the same family, and there was no charity in that family. Her aunt expected that she would pay her own way. Rather than help Ruby find a job, Ruby ended up on the streets, prostituting herself. In the 1940s, Ruby moved all over the West, working as a prostitute under various names. Ruby Lee Schmaus was her legal name. She also used Rosalie Sanders, Shirley Downs, Sue Cunning. She worked in Casper and Sheridan, Wyoming. She worked in Reno, Elko, and Winnemucca, Nevada. She went to Wallace and Kellogg, Idaho. She worked in Spokane, Washington, and in Billings, and here in Butte. When in Reno, she met a man by the name of Frank Garrett. They married August 17th, 1944 in Spokane, Washington, when Ruby was 27 years old. Now, this wasn't your typical marriage. Frank was just a pimp. Let's be clear about that. In later years, Ruby wouldn't even speak of him. He was extremely cruel and abusive to her. He did not work unless he had to. He just lived off of Ruby's income. He repeatedly beat, abused, and threatened her, and she said she lived in constant fear for her life. In 1945, just a year after they married, they were in Sheridan, Wyoming, and she divorced him. Now, unfortunately, as is common with domestic abuse victims, Ruby did not have a good self-image. She was made to believe that she was worthless without a man to take care of her, and with no confidence in her ability to make her way on her own, she ended up back with Frank Garrett. 5 years later, in 1949, Ruby had a son born in Reno, Nevada, which forced Frank to go back to work. Ruby named her son Victor for victory in World War II. She was a big FDR fan. They shortly afterward moved to Spokane. The 1950 census showed the family living in a hotel while Frank worked part-time 30 hours a week as a switchman for the railroad. For a few years, they remained in Spokane while Frank worked half-heartedly for the railroad. And then in 1952, they moved here to Butte. In Butte, Frank, Ruby, and their son Victor moved first to an apartment at 510 South Montana, which no longer exists, and later to this duplex at 815 West Quartz, which still stands. Again, Frank did not work. Ruby worked as a cocktail waitress during this time, and secretly, she saved a little money aside in hopes that she could eventually escape Frank. Ruby later said when she arrived in Butte, Venus Alley was called either Mercury Alley or Piss Alley. She'd never heard it called Venus Alley. She said the police at the time sanctioned the red light district and that any new prostitute in town would be fingerprinted and photographed at the police station and undergo a health screening by a doctor before they were allowed to work in the red light district. The cribs that used to line the length of the alley cost $2.50 per day at that time, and that was paid to the madams that ran the brothels. The alley had a gate at both ends, which was locked and guarded by a policeman. Now, one night after work, Ruby returned home to her Court Street apartment, opened the door, and smoke came billowing out. She ran inside, grabbed her son, and ran out into the night. Frank had come home drunk, smoking a cigarette, and fell asleep on the mattress and started a house fire. That was the incident that helped Ruby clearly see she had to get away from this man. It wasn't so much about her own safety, but she recognized that through either abuse or negligence, Frank was going to end up killing her son. Now, by 1956, Ruby had saved up enough money, without Frank knowing, to purchase a partnership in Rousseau's Hotel and Bar at 228 South Main. Records imply that the hotel part also sold women. For those of you who are well-versed in Butte history, Nick Rousseau, Ruby's partner in Rousseau's, was a famous pimp in Butte. He was the paramour of Madam Beverly Snodgrass. County Attorney, what was his name? James Freeborn. County Attorney James Freeborn.
District Judge.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, District Judge James Freeborn, also known as Dimple Knees. He beat Nick Rousseau to a pulp, which is how he won the heart of Beverly Snodgrass, which eventually led to the inflammatory and infamous Snodgrass report. Now, apparently Rousseau's was a real magnet for loser clientele because Andy Aragoni was also a customer of this bar. Now, Andy Aragoni had his own bar, but he'd rather hang out here trying to charm Ruby. He owned the Silver King Tavern at 330 East Park, which would have been down past the archery place today. The building is gone. Apparently, Andy's charms worked. And in April 1957, Ruby married Andy. Andy made her lots of promises. Among them, she wouldn't have to work anymore, and Andy would support Ruby and her son. Ruby attempted to change her past, leave it all behind, and started calling herself Lee Aragoni. Andy took over management of Rousseau's Bar and Hotel. Now, Ruby's home life, unfortunately, I can't give you a happy ending here. Ruby's home life did not improve after her second marriage. If anything, it got worse. It turned out she traded one abusive pimp for another. Andy had been married up to 6 times previously, and Ruby later claimed that every one of those women had divorced him for extreme cruelty. You can see the notes above from the paper here. This was the previous marriage before Ruby, Laverne M. Hudson in 1956, and less than 8 months later, she leaves him. Only a few months after they were married, Ruby was hospitalized after Andy brutally beat her near unconsciousness. Her doctor, F.B. Duchesneau, stated she was hospitalized for 2 black eyes, contusions of the head and body, and a state of shock. He said on that and other occasions, she told him her injuries came from family quarrels. The Montana Standard reported on April 30th, 1958, that 2 officers arrested Andy for causing a disturbance on South Main, which was presumably outside Rousseau's bar. Ruby filed a complaint against him for disturbing the peace at the same time, but neither she nor Andy showed up in court. June 22nd, 1958, Ruby gave birth to her second son, Stephen Raymond Aragoni, here in Butte. Andy was apparently counting down the days until she could go back to work. And in August 1958, against Ruby's wishes, Andy sold Rousseau's Bar and Hotel and purchased the infamous house of prostitution at 14 South Wyoming from the state of the late Emma Painter Lacasse for $18,200 fully furnished. At first, Andy said she didn't have to work there. Later, he suggested she start to work there, and when she refused, he beat her up. So she said, eventually, I had to do it. Around June 7th, 1959, Ruby came to Andy in the hallway of 14 South Wyoming and told him she was pregnant. To say Andy was furious would be an understatement. He grabbed the nearest item at hand, a washing plunger, and beat her until it broke into 3 pieces. I don't have a washing plunger, but it would be similar to a broom handle. I'm going to pass this around because I want you to understand what it would take to break this into 3 pieces. Don't hit each other with it. Now, when Andy paused for a moment and left the room, Ruby ran away. Is there anybody in the audience today who stands around 6'4", 6'3"? Thank you, Tyler. Is there anybody in here who stands around 5'4"? Would you stand up for me?
Take your shoes off.
Thank you. Okay. Now, you guys are not nearly the weights, so you can ignore the weight part, but height comparison here. Andy stood about 6'4" and weighed more than 250 pounds. Ruby was 5'4" and 150 pounds, 1 foot shorter and 100 pounds less than the man who was beating her up. Thank you. There was not an inch of skin on her body that wasn't black and blue. And needless to say, she miscarried their child. Ruby stayed in a hotel that night. She was afraid to go home. She visited her friends, Margaret Whitford, Josephine Lively, Ray Benson, and Elmer Gardapi, all of whom testified about the severity of the injuries she'd received. Whitford and Benson both noted how much Ruby had changed since marrying Andy. Her outlook on life had worsened drastically, and her general disposition had gone from good-humored and kind to depressed and withdrawn. On June 9th, Ruby told the girls 14 South Wyoming would be closed again that day. So that's A on her map. She was too injured to run the house and too beaten up to appear before clients. She decided to go out, seek out Andy, and reconcile with him. A psychiatrist later said of her, she was holding on for dear life to the security of being a married person for herself and for her children. A psychologist in Butte, Dr. Robert Edmonds, said she held a poor opinion of herself, and Andy was the best she could do, she believed. As to why she did not leave him, he was her symbol of security, the only symbol of security she had. As she searched the bars for Andy, she stopped at Ralph Tripp's pawn shop at 10 South Main, which is B on the map. Ralph Tripp sold her a .32 automatic pistol. Ruby knew nothing about guns, so he cleaned it up for her. He loaded it with ammunition, and she asked him, "How do I know when it's out of bullets?" He said, "Well, I guess when it stops going bang." Now, Tripp said she wanted it for defense purposes, and she had often spoken of the advisability of carrying a gun, considering her profession. Next, Ruby stopped to visit a friend, Ray Benson. Benson had seen Andy beat her on several occasions at Rousseau's bar, and he saw the results of the beating the day prior. Benson signed Ruby's application for a gun permit as a witness, stating that Ruby was a person of good moral character. Then she went up to the courthouse, the top there, quoting from the Montana Standard of January 21st, 1960, Dan Bukvich, Chief Deputy Clerk of the District Court, said the defendant appeared in the clerk's office on the 3rd floor of the courthouse that afternoon and inquired about getting a permit to carry a gun. She was told that such a permit would require the signature of a district judge, and no judge was present at that time. So with the gun in her pocket, she headed to the Ocean Bar. Now it was mid-afternoon at this point. Jean Stanich, owner of the Ocean Bar at 71 East Park, said Ruby came in and ordered a bottle of beer. Before she finished, she went to the phone booth to make a phone call. And while she was in the phone booth, Andy came in. He sat down at the empty stool next to where her bottle of beer was sitting. And Stanich, the bartender, had his back to the couple, but he heard a commotion and turned around. Andy had punched Ruby and she was sprawled across the floor. Her glasses had flown across the room. She was crying. Stanich said Ruby was picking herself up and Andy remained sitting at the bar, doing nothing. Stanich said both were sober, but the woman seemed upset. Shortly afterwards, a taxi pulled up, presumably the phone call Ruby was making, and she left. So Ocean Bar was D on our map. Now we're going to E, the 101 bar at 101 South Main. Around 6:30 or 7 p.m., Clifford Hindman, bartender at the 101, testified Ruby came into his bar and ordered a beer, and later Andy came in again, sat with her for a few minutes, and then he left. And then we come to the infamous last stop on June 9th, 1959, the Board of Trade Saloon at 18 East Park. Andy Aragoni headed over to the Board of Trade Saloon from the 101. The Board of Trade was divided in two. So the front room had a bar and a cigarette counter. The back room had the gambling. Andy went into the back, bought a stack of chips for a lowball poker game, and sat down with 5 other men around the table. Later, Ruby also went to the Board of Trade. Joe Simonich, the bartender, said Ruby came in, she ordered a bottle of beer, and Simonich asked, "How are you, Ruby?" She said, "I'm not too good." Ruby asked him to hold a package for her, and she said, "I may never be back to get it." Ruby left the bar and went into the back room where Andy was seated. She leaned over to Andy's ear and whispered, "Andy, can I talk to you? You won't hit me again, will you?" And in response, Andy did this. Now, he didn't actually hit her, but everyone agreed he had threatened. There were many witnesses to what happened next, and although Ruby denied it in court, many of the witnesses said she said, "You'll never hit me again, you big pimp." She pulled the gun out of her pocket and fired 5 bullets right into Andy Aragoni. Now, she would have fired all 6, but the gun jammed. In the murder trial, Ruby insisted she could remember nothing from the time Andy swung his hand back at her. And several doctors agree that could have been likely given her trauma. Ruby recalled the evening like this: "I heard a noise like an explosion. I came to and I saw smoke all around me. Someone was holding me from behind. I said, 'What had happened?' And someone said, 'You just killed Andy.'" James Giacchino was the dealer that grabbed Ruby by the shoulders, but Ruby made no attempt to flee. Officer Clarence Moon Labreche happened to be drinking in the bar that night. And he came in and said to Ruby, "You know I have to take you in, right?" Ruby said, "Can I finish my bottle of beer first?" And they went into the bar, sat and finished the bottle of beer, and then he took her down to the jailhouse. On June 10th, 1959, the very next day, Ruby was charged with murder of Andy Aragoni. James D. Freeborn and Irvin Roth were appointed as her defense counsel. On June 11th, she sent flowers down to Andy's funeral, which would be held June 12th. She asked to be allowed to attend the funeral, and although the Butte sheriff allowed it, the Beaverhead County sheriff said, "I think that's probably not a good idea." On October 10th, 1959, in a total surprise, Judge T.E. Downey found Ruby Garrett is not and was not the surviving wife of Andrew Aragoni, deceased. It turns out a former wife, Dorothy, several wives ago, as a matter of fact, had filed for divorce, but no one had actually showed up in court to finalize it. This left Ruby penniless. Her entire life savings, as well as her job and her home, were all in 14 South Wyoming, in Andy's name. So on December 15th, 1959, she filed a creditor's claim against the estate of Andrew Aragoni for approximately half its value, which was about $19,000. On January 20th, 1960, her murder trial began. It was an absolute sensation in Butte. There were a ton of witnesses in the Board of Trade, and the stories and rumors absolutely ran rampant around town. Ruby pled temporary insanity brought on by stress. Under direct and cross-examination, she remained firm that her memory is either totally lacking or hazy regarding the events of the evening until she was being interviewed in the police station shortly after the shooting. She said under cross-examination, "I had no thoughts." Doctors testified she was suffering from anxiety hysteria caused by deep emotional stress, tension, apprehension, insecurity, panic, and mental fatigue. Her nervous mechanism reached the breaking point, they said. The thrown elbow was the straw that broke the camel's back. It's interesting to note that this may have been the first time that a history of abuse was used to attempt to exonerate a victim of domestic abuse. On January 28, 1960, Ruby was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced 4 days later to 4 years in the Montana State Prison. 9 months later, Ruby was paroled after about 270 days of her 4-year sentence. I'm going to quote here from an interview that I did with Marilyn Maney Ross, who is a historian here in Butte. Everybody sort of knew that Andy Aragoni was the meanest son of a bitch that ever walked the earth. So were there any tears shed? No. Given the background of us knowing this, and how volatile that relationship and abusive, I mean horrendous abuse, to a person, we never heard anybody say anything, except comments like, "She should have killed the son of a bitch sooner," or "She should have gotten a medal." There was a strong sentiment in Butte that she never should have been arrested and charged. And there were so many, especially the minors, that had these stories about what happened at the time of the murder. And given that it was Butte minors, some of them were true, I'm sure, some of them were embellished, but the point was they were very sympathetic to her. It certainly summed up the notion that everybody who ever really knew her would never believe that she would deliberately hurt anyone, let alone kill someone. On December 21st, 1960, Ruby settled for $3,500 from the Andrew Aragoni estate to start her life over again. There were 10 children claiming a portion of that estate, plus his former wife, Dorothy. Now, as an, again, side note, 14 South Wyoming went up on the auction block at that time, and that's when Beverly Snodgrass purchased that building. For 10 years after her release from prison, Ruby's employment is left to the imagination. She was getting older, into her 50s, and it must have been more difficult to make a living in sex work. In 1970 and 71, she worked as a nurse's aide at St. James. But in 1972, she purchased the famous brothel, the Dumas Hotel, from the estate of the former Madam Bonita, who died of cancer in 1971. Ruby rented rooms to her girls and did not take a cut of their service fee, which was generally around $20. She paid $200 to $300 per month plus tips to the police for protection services. She preferred the term landlady to madam. She was always proper, but she also had many strong opinions about sex work. "I never did see anything wrong with prostitution. It should be considered a commodity," she said in the Boston Globe. She said society has a double standard, and the prostitutes who are criticized are often no different from so-called respectable girls. Ruby ran a clean, middle-class operation. She was strict with her girls. They wore dresses or nightgowns, and they behaved properly. Many of her girls had serious problems and were uneducated, she acknowledged. If you let them run around, they'd hustle the bars, and next thing you know, they'd get into trouble, she said. But they weren't all bums that worked in here, I tell you. In her eyes, workers were sports who had chosen an adventurous way to make a living. Ultimately, they were in control, she said. They could say no. It was the men, poor devils driven by desire, who acted like cattle, she said. If you don't think it's morally wrong, then it's kind of fun, she said in 1991. On the other hand, it's a nerve-wracking business. It's a dangerous business, she said. I've been held up 3 times. Once, a woman drove by the Dumas and thought she saw her husband's car parked out front. She pulled a gun and shot 4 times through the door. One of the bullets whizzed right past Ruby's head. Another bullet almost hit a customer. Hiding places abounded in the Dumas, such as secret crawl spaces and a specially equipped refrigerator. Anyone who's there, I'm sure, has seen that, or who has visited there has seen that still. Oh, Sandra used to hide in there all the time, Ruby said. The refrigerator had the shelves removed. It had a lock on the inside of the door, and it had air holes cut in the back. Sandra, according to Ruby, was the nervous type, and when the heat was on, she would hide in the refrigerator whenever the doorbell rang. Sandra, who was French, worked at the Dumas until she was 61 years old. Men used to ask for her left and right, Ruby said. But the final robbery at the Dumas was the worst. It was very scary, Ruby said. Very, very scary. At 10:15 p.m. on October 3rd, 1981, someone knocked on the Dumas' back door. Ruby opened the slot to see who it was, and a man shouted, "This is one hot Mexican, let me in!" When Ruby opened the door, 2 men forced their way in with a gun. The men grabbed Ruby and the 3 girls that were working on the downstairs floor, and it hit Ruby over the head with a gun, gashed her head open so she bled profusely, and beat the other 3 women, kicking one of them repeatedly in the stomach and the groin until she couldn't walk. They took all the cash in each of the girls' rooms, tied them together with rope and lamb cords. They said if one of us moved, we'd all choke to death, Ruby remembered. Unbeknownst to the robbers, another woman was upstairs, hiding from the robbers. She came down and untied the others and called the police. There were 2 suspects, Gary Lemire, the husband of a woman who had briefly worked at the Dumas, and David Madera. A search of Lemire's apartment turned up a nylon stocking like the one the robbers had pulled over their heads, and 2 hand-drawn maps, which the police contended were of the Dumas. Fearing retaliation from the cops, the newspaper said, most of the women left the same day and have not been seen since. Makes you wonder about the trouble the cops expected they were talking about there. Sheriff Bob Butorovich locked the door of the brothel after the robbery, and it never reopened for its intended purpose, cementing the history of the Dumas as the longest operating brothel in the U.S. Sheriff Butorovich reported later that Ruby showed up in his office and laid 10 $100 bills on his desk, thanking him for his investigation and work on the burglary. Of course, I knew what she wanted. She wanted me to let her reopen, but I didn't, he said. I called the county attorney and dictated a letter saying Ruby Garrett had just donated $1,000 to Crime Stoppers. And many years later, I saw him in a bar, saw her in a bar, and she told me she still supported me, so we got along all right. Besides the recurring headaches, Ruby suffered one more injury because of the robbery at the Dumas. In Ruby's words, I knew you had to pay taxes on the legal business, but I never dreamed you had to pay them on an illegal business. Discrepancies over how much cash was actually stolen during the robbery led the IRS to investigate Ruby's income. On June 18th, 1982, she was found guilty of tax evasion. The IRS claimed she earned about $170,000 from 1975 to 1978, but she only reported $27,000 in income. They claimed she owed $56,000 in taxes, and she had only paid $4,600. If Ruby had been found guilty of all 4 charges, she could have had to pay $40,000 and spent 20 years in prison, on top of court costs. She settled her bill with the government for $10,000 and pled guilty to 1 count of tax evasion. She was sentenced to 6 months in a low-security prison in California. Everybody thought I made $1 million in this business, she said. I didn't make a dime. I paid $10,000 when I went to prison, and that broke me. And again, I keep jumping back to the Snodgrass report because it's so interesting, but there's a paragraph in there that mentions, imagine how much in bribes was going out the door in cash. You couldn't put that down on your taxes.
No.
Maybe not $170,000 worth, but certainly something. Now, do any of you remember Red Beckman? He was a tax protester who wrote a book claiming that the 16th Amendment to the Constitution had never been ratified properly, and so it was okay for you not to pay income taxes. Since been debunked for anyone who's curious. Ruby attended one of his lectures in Butte just a month or 2 before she got arrested by the IRS. So some people speculate that brought a little more attention than she bargained for. Now, we have to jump backward a little bit to about 1973. Ruby bought a home site on the old Baker Ranch in Divide, Montana, right alongside the Big Hole River, where she planned to enjoy a peaceful retirement. The local rumor is she showed up to pay for the place with a paper bag full of 5s, 10s, and 20s. Now, Divide is your standard, close-knit, small-town ranching community, but no one that I've spoken to there batted an eye at their new neighbor. And it seems most embraced her fully. The ranch wives and postmistresses became her friends, and together they went to see dinner theater, the Virginia City Players, they joined night school classes together, they visited regularly. So when Ruby was sentenced to prison for tax evasion, she had a big community of supporters who were shocked to see her go. All of the quotes above came from the Montana Standard of June 23rd, 1982, at Ruby's going away party in Melrose. One person who knew her later said, "The people in Divide treated her very well, and she was very fond of them." And in her later years, I think that was kind of a salve for an aching heart that she was treated so much better there. So you can see, I think it's a crime that a fine woman like this is sent to prison. I've done more things wrong than this woman. She's a good neighbor. She doesn't cause anybody any trouble. Out here, that's all she is, a good neighbor. We wanted Ruby to know she isn't alone, and we feel she is a great lady. We don't think a 64-year-old woman should have to spend 6 months in jail, especially when John Hinckley Jr. got off for shooting President Reagan. Sent off to prison, Ruby declared Billings' jail was 100% better than Butte's jail, which was deplorable. The Pleasanton, California federal prison was an improvement again. She described landscaped grounds where inmates could walk about, a fine education program, crafts, hobby shop, painting, a law library, sports like basketball, baseball, and tennis, weekend movies, and the occasional dance with a live band. But she missed home terribly. She suffered from a hernia, high blood pressure, and asthma aggravated by the cigarette smoke from all the inmates around her smoking. Her 8x10 cell gave her claustrophobia. The doctor eventually ended up upgrading her to a single room where she was allowed to keep the window open night and day. She wrote several letters back home, some to Rick Foote, a journalist at the Montana Standard. And while they give a picture of her daily life, they also show how desperately she longed to return. "I know it sounds silly for me to be planning to leave for home already, but that's how anxious I am and have been ever since I've been here. It was awfully hard on me this trip. Maybe age, the leading factor, is the reason. I've less than 3 never-ending months left, and while I feel like it's an eternity, but when I realize how lucky I am to some of the others here, I could shout with joy. If my blood pressure stays down, I'll make it. Well, they can't get a tough Montanan down, right? God help me. Remember Clarence Moon LaBrush, the officer who arrested Ruby at the Board of Trade after she shot Andy Aragoni? In 1985, LaBrush visited Ruby again, this time at her home in Divide. Ruby wasn't home, but no matter, LaBrush had brought along his friends, Officer Louis Markovich and Tom Hafer. You see, LaBrush owned a bar, the D&M, in Butte, and one night a customer who worked as a contractor told LaBrush about a curious job he'd done, installing a secret floor safe in Ruby's home near Divide. Well, LaBrush knew Ruby had a problem with the IRS and surmised she was hiding her cash in that floor safe. So Tom Hafer bought a car identical to Ruby's. And one day while she was out, they drove up to the house, broke in. Tom Hafer burned through the safe door, and the trio walked away with Ruby's retirement savings. They were right in guessing Ruby wouldn't report the missing money. The news of the robbery didn't come out until all the crooked cops were busted in 1989. The money was never recovered. A few years after the robbery in Divide, Ruby found she could no longer pay property taxes on the Dumas building. The building hadn't been used since it was locked in 1982, and it was suffering from a lack of upkeep. She held a series of rummage sales, selling off the antiques inside, hoping to raise the funds or at least stave off some collectors. During one of the rummages, an antiques dealer by the name of Rudy Gajcek expressed an interest in the building. They reached a handshake agreement. I could see that he could do what I wanted done there, Garrett, Ruby said. If it was going to be a casino or something like that, I'd just as soon see it torn down. When I used to think about it being torn down, she said, I'd cry. Gajcek opened an old-time photo studio and antique store along with giving tours of the building. He and Ruby remained friends, although he wanted to capitalize on the scandalous history a little more than she was comfortable with. When he suggested selling t-shirts, she had to put her foot down. He wanted to say, that famous whorehouse, Ruby said. That sounded terrible. That was so coarse. So they agreed on Butte's famous House of Pleasure. The Dumas passed through Rudy's hands to Michael Peace and Travis Escalation and is currently owned and operated by David and Charlie Prince, who were helpful with this research, by the way. Ruby was more or less forced into retirement at 65 years old when the Dumas was closed and she went to federal prison in California. She never sought an early retirement, nor did she shy away from advocating for her profession. Again, from that Boston Globe article in 1987, she shares she'd be happy to continue on where she could operate a legitimate business. I'm the end of the line, said Ruby Garrett. Some people in the trade think we should bury the past, but I think some of it at least should come out. Prostitution should be legalized as a necessary evil, she said. If prostitution were legalized in Montana, I'd be the first one in line applying for a license. She asked that the following notice appear at the close of that article. Madam, available after 45 years of experience to run a brothel, preferably in Nevada. Ruby spoke of writing a book, which unfortunately never came to pass. She rarely spoke of regrets, though in the Montana Standard in 1991 she said, I don't think I would have become a nun or a sister, but I would have done some things differently. I think it's very vital for historical reasons, she said, to preserve the history of the line and the brothels. Garrett also wanted to write a book titled The Last House on the Block, detailing the history of the house and her life. If you can't go down in history as good, which I can't, I figure what the heck, I might as well go the other way. Ruby lived in Divide until her various health issues including asthma and glaucoma, caused her to move to the Crest Nursing Home in Butte. She lived her last years out of the spotlight, which was fine by her. I just want to have a little peace and quiet in my life, she said. Chris Fisk told me some of her favorite times were at the Crest Nursing Home. She passed away in 2012, the last of the living legends. Her obituary was front page news in Butte and in 75 other papers across the country. In speaking to people who knew her, several noted her big heart. She was the kindest person I ever knew, Marilyn Maney Ross said. Despite being sometimes outcast from society, Ruby's generosity was unmatched. She funded scholarships to send students here in Butte to Tech. She purchased uniforms for the Melrose Band. She helped Charlie Judd out at Christmas with presents for orphans and school clothing and supplies for low-income children. Later in life, it said, she drew on her own traumatic past to provide a safe shelter for domestic violence victims and their children, hiding them until they could be transported away from their abusers. Ross told me, one of the things that I have most respect for her is her incredible resilience. Even though she had been mistreated in ways that most of us can't even imagine, she never gave in to the bitterness and hatred and anger that so many people do. She outlasted all the others, Chris Fisk told me. He said, she would be the dream grandmother of any child. I honestly wish to God she would be remembered for that instead. As I mentioned earlier, I'm still collecting stories of Ruby. So if anyone has a story they'd like to share, I would love to hear them. I also would love all of your questions about what I've learned and what I presented today. So please, yes ma'am.
Well, that was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
So my comment